Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Drumversations, another Friday. At the end of another rough week in America, where we're continuing to see protests and some action, but still a lot of inaction. Today, we're going to focus on the theme, I Can't Breathe, and really discuss what that means for me personally, and what I think it means wider, and still sitting with the pain and the trauma, but now maybe starting to look forward in a maybe not a new way, but in a way that's helpful. But as always, we need to take some time to breathe. Just breathe in and out. Center ourselves. All the craziness in. Breathe in good vibes, breathe out all the craziness, out. And we also, as always, want to remember and honor our ancestors. So as we go into this first piece, which is always the Ancestor Veneration piece, ancestral drum call, just type your name, the name of your ancestor into the chat, and we'll call them out later. Oh, and if you're on Facebook and you're having problems here, we're live streaming on YouTube at youtube.com/CFG Multimedia. All right, Ancestral Drum Call. Glad you all are here. All right. All right. So we have some ancestors. Charles Bell, Ashe. Edna Bell, Ashe. Mike Bell, Ashe. Who? Danielle Bell, Ashe. George Bell, Ashe. William Bell, Ashe. Ed Bell, Ashe. Cuz Dante, good to see you on the line. Hello, family. Good to see y'all. Who else is? Yeah. What's up, YouTube? So we've got the YouTube feed here and the Facebook feed here. We've been trying to work out kinks, so we think we got it, but it's just not, easy trying to do this on multiple platforms. So we appreciate the patience you all have shown and for hanging in there with us through this COVID. So, with everything going on, it's been a lot to manage the pandemic, to manage, what work looks like from Zoom and all of that. And I just wanted to share a little bit about what I think is the significance of George Floyd, not his death, right? I think that's self-explanatory, but what he said when and what was meant in a larger way, not larger than his life, but in a larger social, political, cultural way, when he said, "I can't breathe." That metaphor is so powerful in the context of colonialized Africa and an America that enslaved Africans and still continues to oppress Black Americans. Personally, in the context of all of this stuff going on with a wife and my youngest daughter who have asthma, compromised, breathing, and still feeling like they have to go out and protest because it's that important, right? And not just putting your life on the line because of police, but even further endangering yourself because of this virus, right? And then my oldest daughter, who just graduated high school, feeling as though she also has to break quarantine to go protest and not just make the case that Black Lives Matter, but be present in the struggle for her own Black life, right? And in that context, my girls are out there protesting, and I'm home, not because I don't want to protest, but because my work is on Zoom and on phone calls. And so I can't be present for them out in the streets and at the same time be present for a lot of folks around the country, whether they be artists or politicians, policy influencers, thinkers, colleges who are having summer classes trying to grapple with these issues. So my work as an academic and even artist keeps me, relatively safe while my family is out there risking their lives to just operate in the fullness of their humanity and make sure that people understand what that means. And we're fighting in all of our different ways, but the stress that puts on a family, to have to survive a pandemic, to fight for your life, and then go to work like everything's cool because you work in white spaces. That's a level of stress that most people who aren't Black in America don't understand. And my wife is like, "You're always tired." And I'm like, "Yes, I'm always tired." And she's always tired because this is what we have to go through daily. And I've spoken to a lot of Black executive directors and nonprofits, a lot of Black folks in corporate America who have the same level of exhaustion. But because we live in a country that does not honor our mental health and our physical health, obviously, because it doesn't honor our lives, we have to live in this kind of bifurcated existence where on the one hand, we have to appear appropriate for white America because we're professionals, right? And on the other hand, we have to, put our masks on and march to make sure that we have the opportunity to go to work and be treated as magic Negroes, It's not just stressful. It's why viruses like COVID-19 are so deadly to us. It's why chronic syndromes like diabetes are so deadly to us, right? Carrying this level of stress affects our ability to fight disease. Racism literally compromises our immune systems. And so having to live through all of that has just been draining, honestly. I'm exhausted. But that doesn't mean that we can't fight. But what is it like to have to fight daily, whether it's in the boardroom, the corporate office, or on the streets, and still not be able to breathe, right? Both literally and metaphorically. We're stifled because we cannot be fully ourselves in a way that is protected, right? That's an inability to breathe. Eric Garner, was just selling single cigarettes on the street when Daniel Pantaleo came up with several other officers and put this illegal chokehold on him. And Eric cried out, "I can't breathe." And he said it many, many times. And none of the officers cared. And I've heard recently that the officers who may have wanted to say something to Pantaleo but didn't, because they didn't want to be complicit on film, because they knew they were being filmed, in trying to assert in some kind of way that the police were making a bad choice in taking Eric's life. But he couldn't breathe. They literally cut off his ability to draw breath. And in that moment, Black America could not breathe again, right? Black America really isn't allowed to breathe, because if we were able to breathe, things would be different. How do I know that? Because of the Tulsa massacre, right? Black Wall Street, in many different areas of the country, down in the South, in the West, and they were breathing in that moment. And by breathing and being able to be themselves, these communities were economically doing better than their white neighbors. And that's why they were killed. That's why those areas were brought down. It wasn't because of some criminal nature of the African descendant peoples in those neighborhoods, the black folks. No. If you look at most of the lynching pictures, those people are in suits and dresses and overcoats. They were business people. They were lynched and killed in general in the context of the massacres because they were competition. And so even as a result of those brief periods, Black America has had to hold its breath. Because if ever we were able to breathe fully, it creates a crisis for us. And, this whole idea of race as a public health crisis is a crisis, absolutely. But again, and I've said this before, but I really believe this, our inability to breathe is not because we don't want to breathe. And it's not because we can't breathe. It's that historically white America has not allowed us, has not wanted us to breathe. Because when we breathe, there's some kind of competition, some kind of, deficit that they see in themselves, And I'm speaking, of course, generally. But we created the world, right? We created math, we created science, we created notions of deity, and we were breathing then. And even not being able to breathe, it's black culture that dictates American culture to the world. And we're not able to breathe. Imagine what we would be able to do if we could breathe. Eric Gardner couldn't breathe because the police choked him for selling cigarettes. And imagine this, the brain can only survive for about 6 minutes without oxygen. The brain can only survive for 6 minutes without oxygen. Eric Garner and George Floyd were both choked, obviously, longer than 6 minutes. And metaphorically, Black America has been choking for 401 years. We've not been able to breathe for centuries. So it's in that context that I play this piece I've been thinking about, I Can't Breathe. Got to get all my tools. I can't breathe. We've got more ancestors to shout out and honor. Bill Taylor, Ashe. Verna Lomax, Ashe. What's up, Dad? Oh, Uncle Dale. I knew it had to be one of y'all. Love y'all. Thank you for being here. So, I can't breathe. We can't breathe. Hearing George Floyd and Eric Garner say those exact words as the breath was literally being drawn out of their bodies by police, state-sanctioned murder, is not just the reason why we're in the streets. It's not just the reason why we're on these calls trying to focus on the work of building sustainable structures, policy, and all other kind of things to ensure that we can breathe. It's not just their lack of the ability to breathe. It's the fact that we've not been able to breathe for 4 centuries and 1 year, right? It's that we can't breathe even on the best of days, right? Even on the best day in America, it's hard for black people to breathe. This is not new either. That's what's so crazy. It's not just even about 400 years. The idea and the expression "I can't breathe" is not new. In fact, in the early 50s, psychologist and African thinker Frantz Fanon, in Black Skin, White Masks, said that when we revolt, it's not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe. And he's writing in the early 50s and exploring the nature of racism and colonialism and their impacts on the psyche of the colonized and the colonizer, right? Why is it so powerful a statement to say, "I can't breathe"? Beyond the obvious, right? Beyond the obvious loss of life that's happening at that time. It's a powerful statement because it is the most natural instinct of the human body to breathe. It's the thing we do without thinking about. When you cannot breathe, you cannot be. And what Fanon argues, and what I extrapolate from his argument, is that if we cannot breathe as the colonized in America and in the continent and in the wider diaspora, then it's got to be hard for the colonizer to breathe too. And this is what a lot of folks miss. Thomas Jefferson, my favorite slave owner, said, and I'm paraphrasing, that he was worried about what we would do if and when black people in America gained power, which is why he was one of the advocates for sending everybody back to Africa, which established Liberia in its capital, Monrovia, after James Monroe, right? He couldn't breathe. The white elite of his day couldn't breathe. And I would imagine they can't now. And I imagine it's harder for them to even draw breaths than back then, because now we have this multicultural coalition of folks out in the street, because these young people are tired of not being able to breathe. I literally saw a sign that said, "You fucked with the last generation." Like they're done. They're playing no games, right? It is just such a natural thing to be able to breathe, and not just breathe, but breathe freely, deep breaths. Right? That's why we start with the breath, because that's one of the most powerful things we can do. And the fact that we've not been able to breathe at all, or in rare cases in the last 400 years, is why those words are so powerful, right? And why Fanon says that's the reason why we revolt. It's not because of anything else. It's because the pressure, the oppression, and racism, all those other things have gotten to a point where we literally feel ourselves suffocating. And imagine how much that has to be, how much pressure that has to be when we are asphyxiated daily, right? For you to be in a constant state of the inability to breathe freely to feel like you can't breathe. This is not varying degrees. It's like a constant pressure, and then the pressure just gets that much heavier, and we erupt. And the only way to prevent that is to, obviously allow us to breathe. But, it's the consistent psychological violence that Fanon is referring to that takes away our breath. How? Because in America, one of the ways that we are taught not to breathe fully is how the narrative is constructed about and around us, right? The inherent criminal nature of the black man or the angry black woman, right? It puts us in a position where, as a woman, you cannot voice your real opinion because you're afraid that you might be seen as an angry black woman and therefore be pushed to the side, further marginalized and not heard, and nothing happens, so you hold that in. And when you hold that in, it works on your body and it hurts your body because you have to make sure other people in the room feel safe, right? For black men, it puts us in the crosshairs of police and other folks. I mean, literally, during the protests right now, you have armed white militia showing up to, quote unquote, keep the peace. And so we have to contend with regular white folks with guns and white folks who are police officers with guns, all just because we want to breathe, right? We never see equitable representation of ourselves in terms of standards of beauty and success. I was just at the grocery store, and I every time I go to the grocery store, I purposely look at the newsstands just to see if I'm there, right? And what I see, if I see black faces, they're in entertainment, sports, they're rappers, they're mainstream artists like Beyonce. I never see a black lawyer, a black doctor, right? I never see an academic. I never see, people who are doing, beyond the Obamas, people who are doing the real work of building up their people. I see Oprah, but Oprah is signed, sealed, and approved by white women across America, right? That really doesn't work for me. So we never see real versions of success that bring up black America. We see versions of success, if we see them at all, that are safe for white America, right? Because it's a power dynamic. Racism is about power. And so when you have power over media, you have power to control the narrative. Those narratives work on us subconsciously, right? This is as real as white Jesus and the black devil, right? The white knight and the dark knight, good and bad, right? John Wayne, the cowboy, and the evil Injun, right? That person of color, that dark-skinned person. Tarzan gonna be in the jungle because he was what? Because he was white and privileged, so the apes and everybody just took him in and taught him their ways, and now he's king of the jungle? Like, those images, those stories work on us from day one. From day one. And it slowly begins to suffocate us. In his book, Awakening the Genius of the Black Child, Amos Wilson argues that when we're born as Africans and African-descended people, we're born absolutely brilliant and ahead of most other ethnic groups in terms of babies and their abilities, right? But after a few years, though that edge that we have naturally because of melanin and all the other things, it starts to be displaced and depressed because those narratives start working on us from the very beginning. We have been traumatized. Here's another way. We've been traumatized by public executions since before America knew itself as a country. The whole idea of social control by a minority, and imagine we're the ones called the minority, but a social control by a minority over a majority has to, in the American and Western context, be brutal. So the whole notion of buck breaking, where they took the strongest black man, African man, put him in the center of the square, whether it's a city or a plantation, and did unconscionable things to him. including cutting off his testicles and looking at everybody else and saying, let that be a lesson to you. That's a public execution. Lynching was not private. They hung these people from a tree so everybody would see and know. It's the equivalent of medieval putting heads on spikes, right? Public executions have been part of the way in which America has controlled its people of African descent. We cannot breathe because of these experiences, because of these traumas, because of these narratives that constantly work on our psyche. Constantly work on our psyche. I got a good job, I'm paid well, but everything that I say in the context of that job, because it's a white space, has to be monitored and edited and monitored and edited and monitored and edited to make sure that I'm saying what I need to say as authentically as possible, but also in a way that allows me to keep food on my children's table, because I'm not free to be free. Even in the best context, even on the best day in America, black people can't breathe. And so to hear our brothers dying and their last words are, I can't breathe, it's enough to just see that murder. But it has all of this other context behind it. And to hear even well-meaning white folk treat these as isolated incidences and just about police brutality means that that's just another level of ignorance that white America has to the wider context of the meaning behind these words. I can't breathe. I want to play something else. So I can't breathe. Um, I can't breathe. Um, you know, I got all these notes, and it's just it's crazy because I feel like to some extent it's the same story, but a lot of people just don't have context for the story. They don't have the personal context for the story. The fact that we have to carry, oxygen in any way we can, just to get a breath sometimes. And for me, that's Drumversations. For me, is the podcast Ruth and I started that you can find on SoundCloud of the same name, Drumversations. We're recording the second one this weekend. It's, anything and everything I feel like I can do to help move the culture forward is how I get a breath. But that work is so exhausting. It's exhausting to have to always help white people figure it out, whether it's in the office, whether it's in the community, because there's Google. The information is there. But because America is so hell-bent on providing its citizens from birth this narrative, it doesn't really teach any of us the truth of why things are the way they are. And that's why things don't change. My father said poignantly, I'm going to quote him twice. This is the first time. He said, because Africans were the first human beings, it really is it's incumbent upon us, I'm paraphrasing, to teach the rest of the world how to be human. It's a phenomenal responsibility, right? And I feel like it shouldn't be ours. You know what I mean? But in many cases, we have to be the ones to forgive. We have to be the ones to reach out. We have to be the ones to forget that to be in America every day means that our lives are on the line. Because that's the only way we can leave the house. But like Breonna Taylor, you don't even have to leave the house to get killed by police, right? But I'm just saying, like, in general. I was talking to my daughter, Layla, and she was talking about flying or something like that. And, it wasn't a fear to fly. She was excited, but she was like, I don't know about flying. Maybe I'm scared. I'm like, do you know that flying is safer than being in a car? And yet you get in a car every day with no problems. It's because those things aren't top of mind. Like, she's got all this data that's disparate and no context sometimes. And because there's no context, she does the thing that's even more dangerous without even thinking about it than the thing that is safer, right? And that's kind of how we live every day in America. In order to just kind of get through a day, you literally just have to forget the stuff that happens, microaggressions, right? We have to kind of give people passes. Oh, maybe they didn't mean that, but we know you meant that, white America. But it's a survival technique that, again, works negatively on our systems, which is why we are so prone to get sick during COVID. Consciously or subconsciously, America benefits from all of this, right? I'm not saying necessarily that every white American knows, but every white American benefits from the trauma that Black America faces. Every single one, even the most poor, right? The wounds that don't heal ensure that in the aftermath of every occurrence, we have the same process. This thing happens, and some form of great white savior comes and offers an olive branch really quickly, right? Philanthropy and corporate folks, they make these shirts or these statements about how Black Lives Matter, and you get funding for your nonprofit right now, but like in 6 months that funding will go away because we don't want to fund, we America don't want to fund the liberation of anyone other than real red-blooded Americans, right? Even, you have politicians saying, we want to get justice, but what they really mean is just us and not all of us, right? For us, Black folks, it's just them. So how do we capture this energy and move it forward in a way that brings real equity, real enfranchisement, and inclusivity for Black people in America, and by extension, every other person of color? That's really what I hope sitting through and reckoning with this pain that these public displays of violence brings us to. The question that I hope it brings us to is, how do we move, not beyond it, how do we move through it in a way that gets us to a viable solution? You know, I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, and I said, I think the fear of well-resourced white Americans in this conversation is that they have to give up some resources in order for this thing to be right. And I'm not saying that they don't have to give up something. Absolutely, they have to give up something. But what we're not coming for necessarily is your house. Like, you're not going to lose your house right now because of reparations. I'm not concerned about your house, and I'm not concerned about your bank account. What I'm concerned about is the access to resources, right? It should not be easier for any one person, because of how they look, to have the opportunity to build wealth, right? Even in the most, perfect circumstances, businesses are successful and they fail. I just want to be able to fail and have that opportunity to build another business, right? Chris Rock said his neighbor is a dentist. He had to be a successful comedian, millionaire, to live there. Entertainer. All his white neighbor had to do was be a dentist, right? And Chris Rock said for him, America would be great if black people could fail forward in the same way that white folk are able to fail. Like, that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. And, there are several books about reparations. There's a link on my homepage, marklomaxii.com, to a list of resources that include some of that information if you want it. But, it's not that you have to give up what you own now. It's that you have to be equitable about the opportunity to build wealth, the opportunity to be healthy, right? Every person in America should have access to health care, and not just any health care, quality health care. That's not a black issue, that's a human issue. But because black people have disproportionately not been able to access health care, we need that more than other folks, right? And equity suggests that we get greater access based on our greater need. But it doesn't mean that you, if you're not black, don't have access, right? And I think we need to have real conversations about what that kind of stuff means. And it's like, when I talk about savior and philanthropy and politicians coming, it's an act. Like, we see it all the time. I got two examples for you. In 1964 and 65, we got the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, right? In 1964, Malcolm X got killed, assassinated, right? So we give you this policy, this legislation, and we take away one of your leaders, right? 6 in one hand, half a dozen in the other. That's exhausting, right? Because you didn't really actually win, right? In 65, we got the next piece of legislation, and 3 years after that, we lose King to assassination. We didn't actually win, because those were the first steps in what King recognized was this longer trajectory toward economic inclusivity and enfranchisement, which is what he was working on, the Poor People's Campaign, when he was killed. So we get these two pieces of legislation, and then we lose two very important people, among others, right? Another example is the 13th Amendment, which effectively made slavery illegal, except, I'm gonna read it to you so you understand, except if you were convicted of a crime, right? The 13th Amendment in 1865 abolished slavery with this language, like sort of abolished slavery. It reads, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, here's what it should have said. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subjected to their jurisdiction. That would have effectively abolished slavery, made it illegal, period. But that clause, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, allowed slavery to evolve into what became the mass incarceration or prison industrial complex, right? So what we do now is criminalize you and pick you up for just standing on a corner because you're loitering, right? And then we have this thing called convict leasing, where we send you to prison, and then the people who own the prison, whether it's the state or private owners, they make money leasing your labor to white companies, corporations, right? That's slavery by another name. If you haven't read that book or checked out that documentary on PBS, check it out because it explains all of that. So America has never intended to enfranchise its black people post-slavery. That's another reason why we can't breathe, because we know that you've lied to yourself and you continue to lie to us, but we know you're lying. Right? So how, again, does this pain get us to a point where we see something differently? You know, where do we go from here? My dad, in his sermon last week, said that I'm writing. I wrote down what he said. He said that we need to figure out how to come together and imagine a new reality, even in the midst of conflict. Right? We need to create a vision from an organizing principle. And for him, based on what he was saying in his sermon, that organizing principle is God, or our concept of God, right? For me, in a more secular setting, that organizing principle is our collective humanity, which for me is a physical manifestation of God. So how do we collectively see a world where we practice a politics of humanity, right? How do we see a world where realizing our optimal human potential is the norm? That's what happens as a matter of course. How do we see a world where our differences are obviously what makes us stronger, and our issues revolve around deciding how best to provide what's necessary for each and every one of us to be our best, right? How do we see a world where capitalism, read exploitation, is replaced by a resource-based economy that ensures a higher quality of life for all through the use of technology and science to manage resources and live in balance with each other and the planet, right? How do we do these things? I think from an African-centered perspective, we have to live according to the Nguzo Saba, the 7 principles of Kwanzaa, right? Umoja, unity; Kujichagulia, self-determination, because freedom ain't free; Ujima, collective work and responsibility; Ujamaa, cooperative economics, because we are our greatest resource; Nia, purpose; Kuumba, creativity; and Imani, faith in ourselves and each other, right? Wherever we go from here, however we decide to move through this pain, we have to do it together or we continue to lose. We have to establish a collective vision where we all can exist as in our optimal human capacity. And we all have to ensure that our children have that same opportunity and more. And whatever you have to give up to make that happen, none of that is valued more than your life. King gave up his life. Eric Garner's life was taken. George Floyd's life was taken. Breonna Taylor's life was taken. Trayvon Martin's life was taken. Sandra Bland's life was taken. John Crawford's life was taken. All because we have not given what's necessary to ensure that we can be together. What's the value of that? What's the price on that? How much are you willing to commit to that reality? Black people in America, our lives are on the line every day. What about you, white folks? Thank you for joining us today. We can't breathe, but hopefully we'll find some air pockets until we all can breathe together. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to play us out, unless we got some comments. No? All right. y'all next week.